Hola a todos y a todas y a todes. Acá estamos con Leilani Farha. Mi nombre es Natalia Dopazo y nos encontramos en la previa del encuentro de Ciudades Sin Miedo que se va a dar el 21, 22 y 23 de octubre de este año en la ciudad de Rosario. Vamos a estar hablando en inglés. Ahora Leilani se va a presentar.
Hi, everyone. I'm Leilani Farha. I am the global director of a young international human rights organization focused on housing. It's called The Shift. And the shift is called The Shift because we think we need to move away from the over commodification of housing and return or go to a place where housing is viewed as a human right. And I am also the former United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to housing, a position I had for about 6 years from 2014 to 2020. And that position took me to every part of the world, many cities and countries, including Buenos Aires in Argentina, of course, a couple of times. So I'm really happy to be in conversation for this event.
Thank you very much. We are really happy to have you here. And it's really interesting to have someone that can see this problem in a global perspective and share some information about what do we have in common and what do we have different, like as Latin American cities in Argentina. So first of all, what we wanted to know is like, what does it mean to have a human rights perspective on the housing issues?
Yeah, so I really love working using human rights in the area of housing because human rights is more than what people think. It is a whole framework. It's a whole way of understanding the world and the housing system. So the right to housing is defined, the definition under international law is very broad. So it's not just four walls and a roof. Of course, it is four walls and a roof, but it's much more. It's the right to live in peace, security, and with dignity. And I love the definition, of course, because you can apply it to so many circumstances and you know immediately where people are living in those conditions. You know, you take people living in informal settlements and they may be, and this is true in Argentina, you know, living in informal settlements and they may be evicted. They may lose where they're living. Is that security? When the eviction happens, is it peaceful? Right? So we know right away the answer to those. Some people are living in informal settlements and they have no running water, no electricity. Can you have a dignified life in those conditions? We know the answer. So we know then that human rights are at play. There are, of course, real standards that attach to the human right to housing. Housing has to be adequate. And I've talked a little bit about that already, but it has to be affordable. A huge problem in Argentina, of course, with 100% inflation. No one can afford anything. No one can afford to live, even in informal settlements. So affordability is key to the right to housing, but so is security of tenure. You know, you don't want to be fearful that you're going to lose your home. So is access to services, habitability. Your home has to have electricity. It has to have heating in the cold and cooling in the summer, these sorts of things. It should be culturally adequate. What if you're indigenous? Is your housing, you know, suitable to your culture? So those are some of the standards. The last thing I'll say that makes a human rights framework very unique is it requires accountability. And the reason is because governments have signed and ratified international human rights law. They committed legally to ensure progressively that everyone has adequate housing, progressively over time. And when they made that legal commitment, they said they would be then accountable. And we have mechanisms to hold governments accountable. Sometimes we have domestic mechanisms like courts, even the media can be a mechanism. Statisticians, people who collect data, that's a kind of accountability. And then we have mechanisms in the UN, the United Nations system. As a rapporteur, I was an accountability mechanism asking governments, are you meeting your obligations? So I really think that's an important part of the human rights framework, because there aren't other frameworks that require that accountability.
Yeah, that is interesting because it helps us reframe the housing problem in a global, like not a global perspective, but addressing that this problem is happening in many other cities at the same time. And something that is really interesting about your work is that you're talking a lot about the financialization of housing and these new problems that we are facing. They're really difficult to understand if you're not a specialist, like if you don't study these issues or if you're not related to this in an everyday life. So can you explain us, like, what does it mean to a grounded basis?
Yeah, Natalia, one thing you said, which I want to pick up on, is there are global patterns. And, you know, financialization is one of the patterns that I saw spreading across the world. Before I talk about it, I will just say there are lots of global patterns. There is a global housing crisis, that's for sure. Every country and every city I visited, I could see the same things happening. A little different here, a little different there, but broadly, homelessness increasing everywhere. Informal settlements spreading, growing, getting bigger and bigger everywhere. Forced evictions happening. So as those informal settlements grow, more forced evictions happening, displacement, and then again, more homelessness, unaffordability across the board. No city in the world for low-income people is housing affordable in the formal market, even sometimes in the informal market. And then we have this phenomenon, of course, financialization. So what does it mean? And it's funny because I think I'm a good person to explain it, because I'm a human rights lawyer. I didn't know anything about finance. I barely knew anything about economics when I started looking into this. And so I had to learn it from scratch. So I'm like every other person, so I think I can explain it simply. There is a huge amount of money floating around in the world, capital, we call it. And investors have this money. There are these big entities, private equity firms. They pool money from rich sources, from pension funds, from individuals, from institutions, insurance companies. There are pension funds themselves, sovereign wealth funds, lots of money. And there's more money circulating in the world now than ever before. And that money needs to find a place. It has to park somewhere. It can't just float around. And one of the places it keeps getting parked in is residential real estate. That's what they call it. We call it housing. We call it our home. They call it residential real estate. So these big financial actors and financial players have been scooping up housing, investing in it, using housing as a financial instrument. They purchase so that they can leverage more money and purchase more and grow bigger and bigger and bigger. And the impact of this is very detrimental for the people living in the assets, and I put it in quotes, the assets that they're purchasing. So they buy homes, they buy apartment buildings, and they increase the rents, and they use a variety of ways to increase the rents. They increase the fees attached to those rents, rental accommodations, and those monies are then paid out to shareholders. Often these buildings are literally put on the stock exchange. So I can be living, just to make it concrete, I can be living in an apartment in Manhattan, and that unit can be owned by the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, and my rent can go up, and that will increase the value of the investment made by the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. And So who is my landlord in that case? I'm living in my unit. I expect my landlord to fix my leaky pipe, but I'm given a 1-800 number. I call. Who is my landlord? When a building is traded on a stock exchange, my landlord is a shareholder, is someone who has no interest in me, my family, whether I can pay my rent or not. So this influx of money, I mean, there's many manifestations of the financialization of housing. So I've only given one kind of a broad example, but the impact on tenants is very severe. We are seeing rents escalating. We're seeing people being pushed out of their units. And then they're looking in their community, well, where can I go? Everywhere is too expensive. They're pushed to the outside of city centers, sometimes into informality, often, and homelessness. And I mean, that's not what we want, right? That's not the societies that we want. We all know housing is very central to human well-being, and security of housing is key to mental health and physical health and to life itself. So the impact of financialization is very important from a human rights perspective because it's undermining the human right to housing. So do you think I explained it clearly? Maybe not.
Absolutely, because I think it also relates like with some discussions that we're having in Argentina, especially with natural resources also. It's like the soil, the discussion about who owns the land, who has the right to the land, and also in like it can happen on cities, but it can happen in other places. And I think it's the same discussion with different technologies or different topics that we are having these problems. So what I was thinking about, it's like, what I was thinking about, it's to ask you is how can, which are the things that a local government can do to address this problem? Because it's also difficult to understand who you are fighting against. And that is one of the main issues, I think, of this reality.
I think that's right. And I think city governments are in a very tough situation because they sometimes don't have the resources or the capacity, the power, the jurisdiction to do what's necessary to push back against the actors. It depends on how the city is configured and how governance works within a country. Is it only the national level government that can input regulations and laws, or can the city enact laws and regulations? But where a city has some powers, there are things that can be done. I mean, one of the things I didn't talk about, for example, a kind of financialization of housing is this phenomenon of Airbnb. Because Airbnb is a platform, but really it's sold as a way, it's a kind of investment. It's a way to invest in real estate and make money off of real estate. And it is taking away the long-term housing in a city and making it available for short-term rentals, which are far more lucrative, right? You make in one night what you can make in a week with a long-term rental. And so that's one area that cities really can be active in. Most cities have the capacity and the jurisdiction to control Airbnb. And I mean, there's different things that can go on. One, it can be regulated. It can be severely limited so that really Airbnb is returned to its original intention, which was to provide a little extra income to a household who wanted to rent an extra room in their apartment, or they were going to leave every year for 1 week or 2 weeks and to rent their apartment out. So there can be restrictions and regulations, and many jurisdictions have done that. I'm seeing that across the world. But there's more interesting moves. So for example, at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw in cities like Barcelona, Lisbon, Paris, London, all the Airbnb units empty because no one could travel. And meanwhile, there are key workers, essential workers who had nowhere to live or were living in unaffordable units. There were homeless people. Some cities took it upon themselves, Barcelona and Lisbon, decided we're going to try to go after these units and have them put to use, make them productive. And there's different ways of doing that. So you can entice, you can say, if you give up your unit, we will give you some advantages, give you some tax breaks, etc. Or you can use more of a stick and say, if you don't give up these units, we will tax you, or we will expropriate, or whatever. So that's one thing cities for sure can do. And we're seeing really interesting examples. Some cities have also taken on or tried to take on in a more proactive way by doing things like trying to set rent caps. For example, Berlin is a good example. They tried to establish rent freeze. So I think it was for 5 years, they wanted rents frozen because these investors expect to make a return on their investment quickly, 5 years, 10 years. So if you say, oh, we have a rent freeze in this jurisdiction, then they're not interested in investing in that area because they know they can't make the return for their investors. And so in Berlin, it failed. I mean, it worked, and then it was challenged constitutionally. But it's the type of things cities should be trying, I really feel, to push back against these actors. There's also a phenomenon that's kind of financialization as well, where investors purchase properties and they leave them empty, just vacant units. And I'm seeing cities around the world doing a variety of things. Some very aggressive, trying to expropriate those units. This Barcelona model, after 2 years, if the unit is vacant after 2 years, I think it is, then the city government approaches and says, you either have to let us use this property and rent it out, or we will expropriate it. And in other places, they're taxing vacant homes. So, they put a tax on. So let's say City of Vancouver, 1% tax. It doesn't seem like very much, but it has generated a lot of money that then goes into a pool to help build affordable housing or fund affordable housing. So there's some interesting things cities can do. I really think, cities are on the front line, so they have no choice but to react and to protect local residents and their right to housing. The one thing that, I work with cities closely, and the one thing I say, cities have to understand they too have human rights obligations. So it's not a matter of what can cities do, but what must cities do. They too have human rights obligations. So we have to hold our cities accountable. Even the best cities with the best mayors still have to be held accountable. Are they doing everything that they can to ensure the right to housing? Are they using all of the resources that they have available to them? And a mayor like Mayor Colau in Barcelona really is trying to use everything available to her to ensure affordable housing. And that's because she has a very good understanding of the human right to housing. She was elected on that originally, that platform. But not all mayors are the same. And it's very important that we establish mechanisms to hold cities accountable as well as national governments.
One question that I would like also to ask you is, what can people do? What can social organizations do? Because if we leave, we already know that if we leave everything just to the mayors or just to people in political positions, usually it's challenging for them to push this type of politics. So I was thinking like, okay, the common people, what they can do?
Well, it depends on what you mean by the common people. I mean, we know change comes from the ground. It doesn't come from the top, always from the ground. And so tenants' movements have been very, very important. Remember, Mayor Colau came from a tenants movement, from the foreclosures after the global financial crisis. You know, in Spain, they were very severe. Suicide rates were very high. I mean, it was a very terrible time. And it's the social movement that then galvanized and ended up backing her mayoral election. And so social movements are key. And there's a movement in Spain, that continues to fight very strong and to really push government officials to enact progressive legislation. It's very important. In Berlin, it's the same. It's tenants movements. I'm seeing it in Amsterdam. I'm seeing it beginning more and more in Canada, even where I am from. And of course, it's happening around the world. In Chile, for example, in South Korea, like these movements are gaining momentum and could be incredibly powerful. Sometimes I imagine if we could unite all of the tenants around the world. I mean, it's a huge just tenants. If we could unite tenants and people living in informal settlements, imagine the power. It's such a huge percentage of the world's population. So I do believe that creating movements and getting involved in movements, and it can be very local. It can be your building. You're living in a building. Find out who owns your building. Is it a financial actor? How are they treating you? Demand meetings with them. Demand more from them. Go to the banks that are funding these entities and suggest that the banks don't fund them if it's likely that they will engage in rent increases or evictions. Now, I think taking this matter into our own hands is very important, and really not being afraid to learn. We all, like, this is a whole new world, this financialization. Seriously, the housing system has changed radically since the global financial crisis. We're in a new world and we have to learn it and not be afraid of it. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yes, really helpful. And just for the last question, there's a myth usually in media, not only but media, but there's a myth that if you regulate the market of, for example, housing, that brings imperfection on the market, and that will also, like, the crisis it's rooted in some regulations in the market, you know, like usually this is a myth that's going on. So when some governments try to regulate the market, other people are saying, okay, this will bring more problems. So how can we address these type of myths that we have ongoing, and what can we give them? Like, how can we respond to that?
Yeah, I'm glad you raised this. It's super difficult to combat these myths because the perpetrators of the myths have a tremendous amount of political power. They sit at the economic tables of the highest, right, alongside presidents and prime ministers. And they have positioned themselves quite uniquely to say that they are the solution, not the problem. And that the problem, as you articulated, is to regulate. But I think the facts on the ground really speak for themselves. We've had neoliberal markets across the world. Look at Chile, the most neoliberal of almost all places on the planet. There isn't a place where this neoliberal approach to housing, let the market do what it will do, let the privates play, and they'll provide affordable housing. It hasn't happened. We have growing informal settlements. We have unaffordability in city after city. The graph, the chart for every city is the same. Wages are aligned like this, and housing costs are aligned going straight up. And that gap is not being bridged by the, in quotes, market. It's a myth to think that the market exists outside of laws and policies. The market is a creation of government, laws and policies. And those laws and policies have created the housing crisis. So there is a lot to undo. It's very difficult to undo that mythologizing. But I think the facts is where we start. We say unregulated market. Every market is unregulated, and every market is showing unaffordability. So we have to change something. This isn't sustainable. How is it sustainable? The people who are now able to afford cities rely on lower income people for their way of life. The barista in the coffee shop, the woman who does the cleaning and the laundry, the childcare, the nurses, the doctors, not doctors, because sometimes they make a lot of money, but certainly the nurses, firefighters, police officers, whoever makes a city run. They are not the wealthy people. They are not this elite that the housing market is aimed at. And so if we really want our cities to work well and be vibrant places where, the metro works or the subway works and the bus system and people, are have a sense of well-being, then we have to make some changes. That's, but it takes courage by government, and it takes maybe some different actors, because so many governments are deeply in bed with real estate developers. They're elected. Often they get their money for their election campaigns from these people. So there's a lot of undoing, but here's a little bit of hope. My sense is that there is a new, younger generation who wants to be part of solutions, who sees the world differently, who would be willing to engage in the housing system and the sector, not for such uber profits, who would be willing to try and do things differently. And maybe, it's a business, but it's not this uber crazy business making millions and billions of dollars. So when governments say to me, if we can't piss off the developers because we need them, I'm like, you know what? Piss off the developers. Let's see who comes and says, hey, I'm willing to try to develop deeply affordable housing for my community. Let's see who shows up. I think there's a young generation there ready to do things differently.
Okay, yeah, I really like to wrap up this nice conversation with some hope and some way of thinking alternatively, having new futures imagined for ourselves. So, Leilani, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and your struggle, and hope we meet again soon.
Me too, and I hope the event is successful. I wish I could go there, but next time.
Next time. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.